And we're back, and it's COMP305, week 2, lesson 2, part 2. And we're talking about what the hell is GitHub anyway, like I said, and let's talk about some tools that are really going to be useful for you this semester, you know, for us to build up some of the stuff we need to get. And to kind of satisfy some of the requirements that we have for assignment number 1, right? Because there's some other requirements, some documentation requirements for assignment number 1 that you've never seen before, right? So let's talk about how to satisfy some of those requirements as well. All right, so what is GitHub? GitHub, back in the day, we used to just have something called Git, which was let's see if I can come up with it a little bit. It's a command line tool, Git, right? So if I was to go into my space shooter, and I'm on the Mac here, and if I click Git, it allows me to create what we call a repository, right? That surrounds, or it makes our folder into a repo, a repository. So what does that mean? It means that every time we save, every time we make changes to our folder, right? GitHub or Git knows about it locally in our repo. So we can compare changes. That's what originally GitHub was used for. So we can compare from one version of our code to the next. We modify our project. As soon as we modify our project, and if it's already a Git repo, we've marked it as a Git repo by using the git init command on the command line here, whether you're on Windows and Mac or Linux, it's the same, right? Then what ends up happening, of course, is the changes are saved, right, in an invisible folder that's kept alongside your folder, right? It knows that the changes, and you can actually compare different versions. So that at the beginning, that's all it was, keeping track of our different versions of our code. Now the great thing is you can basically step back and revert your code back to an earlier version, and there's a really good reason for that, because if you're coding, how many people have coded something and gone, man, I just made a change, I don't know what happened, but it broke my code, and I don't know what it is, right? Yeah, it happens all the time, right? What a pain in the ass to try and find that needle in a haystack, right? So the best thing to do is when you have a Git repository set up locally, this is just locally, never mind GitHub, all right? You can always revert, right? Every time you commit a change, all you're doing is making a snapshot. That's what you're doing, creating a snapshot that's getting saved inside that repository, right? Snapshot. So I can revert back, almost like, you know, how Windows used to make changes or a snapshot of your screen whenever there was an update. You can always revert back to an earlier time before the update took place, right? So that's a really good reason for version control. And I have a little PowerPoint that one day that I'll eventually play for you that gives you more detail. But at the end of the day, what it goes is like this. When you have Git, not only can you do things like revert back, but you can collaborate with others, right? To do that, the best way to do it is to use GitHub. Think about it as an online or cloud-based repository, right? So now there's 2 repositories. There's one that's local to your system, the one we can create locally by using some local Git commands, or by using the tools, different tools. You can download actually a tool for Windows. So if you're a Windows user, you can go windows.github.com, I believe. And you can download something called a little collaboration tool for your a little desktop tool for your Windows machine, right? And what it does is a visual representation of your repository that's local, right? But not only that, what GitHub allows you to do is connect with your GitHub repository, the cloud-based repository, right? And push your changes up online, okay? So when you're done, for example, if you're collaborating with somebody else, they can pull down your changes to their system. So imagine you're collaborating with somebody else. You can push up new changes. They pull down your changes. They make changes to whatever you're doing, and they push back their changes up on GitHub. And there's a record of all the changes, all the commits, if you will, the snapshots of all the changes, right? That's the real power of GitHub. It allows you to collaborate with other people and work on a project simultaneously, especially if you're working on different aspects. Like, for example, let's say in a larger application, somebody's working on the views, the UI of the project, and somebody else is working on the database, right? Someone could be working on the database, doing an ERD and so on, right? A database diagram, and they create the database, and the other person's working on the views. The other person's working on the controller. So you have that separation of concerns. Everybody can be working on different aspects, but they can be collaborating together to build the ultimate project, right? So that's what GitHub allows you to do. So there's definitely this for PC. On the Mac version, there's also, I think it's mac.github.com if you're a Mac person. Yes, there is for your Mac, right? And there's also, I don't think they have one for Linux because it's slightly different for Linux. But if you notice, they've changed the download to desktop.github.com, which handles everything. Now, this is the latest desktop version of the little tool, and it shows you how you can branch. Something called branches in GitHub. Now, this is not Git. Git is your local repository. GitHub is your cloud-based repository, right? And what happens is this. You have something called the master branch that just trundles along here, right, with different commits at different time frames, right? Then what happens is you branch off and do a second branch, almost like a different trial or a different version altogether, right? Well, what happens, what you can do is you can actually go off on a tangent with your alternate branch and then merge it with the main branch later on, right? So there's a lot of different usefulnesses to GitHub. Yes, I could go into detail and tell you all the details, but it's a little out of scope for this course. All I want you to do is do two things, right? Share your files on GitHub, and when you make changes, so at every major milestone, push to GitHub again, right? That's all I'm asking you to do. I don't want you to collaborate with anybody at this point or anything like that. Every time you make a major milestone, you make a change, you add a script, you add some assets into your project, push it to GitHub. Worst case, if you mess up, you can always revert, right? You can always go back to the previous state that you were in before. Okay, so there's some really cool tutorials on GitHub if you wanted to look them up online. Like if I was actually just to search up something like GitHub tutorial, right? And look it up and go to videos, there's tons, right? So I highly recommend you look at how to use GitHub, at least in the simplest of ways. Again, there's different ways of using it by downloading the tool, by using the command line, and also it's built into, if I'm not wrong, revision control is built into Unity as well, okay? So different ways of doing that, a little outside of our scope, but the great thing for us is I'll be able to look at your code and I can share my code with you so you can see that and you can fork my stuff into your repository. What do I mean by forking? It's like, consider it like a copy, right? So if I have a repository that I use, I create an API or some kind of code that I want to write, right? And let's say someone else likes my idea, but they want to branch off and do their own code, right? Something that they want to do with my code, like as a jump-off point. They can create a fork of my code and then start working from there. So I've spent X number of hours working on this thing. You don't have to start from scratch. You can start with my code and then go to the next level. Well, I invite you to do that for this assignment. Assignment number 1, fork me. You've already forked me on GitHub. That was part of Lab 1. Go to the next level and change that code and make it your own and make your own shooter type game, right? Now, it may be unusable. You might say, well, I don't want to make a space shooter. I don't want to make what you've done altogether. I want to start from scratch. Great. Then use my code as just example comparison code when you do your tutorial on your own, because there's going to be some changes, something that didn't work for you that worked for me. And you can go, hey, look, Tom's got a completed version that works in Unity 5. He showed us in class. Here it is in GitHub, right? And that's what we're going to be doing, okay? So questions around GitHub and why I want you to use it. Okay, it's pretty clear, but just in case, that's why we do these things. We do this stuff on GitHub so that way we share our code. I do this in every class, by the way, so if you take class with me again, I'm going to share my stuff on GitHub again and again and again. I might even give you another lab that gives you 2.5% to create a GitHub account, right? So it's important. It's such an important thing these days when you're a software developer to be able to share your code somewhere, and GitHub is one of the best places to do it. There's others too, by the way. Lots of others. Okay, let's get to some of the tools that I asked you to use from before. One of the tool sets that I talked about in your assignment, let's go back to your assignment for a second. I asked you to create some documentation. And inside the documentation here, in your internal documentation, I said, hey, if you notice here, I've asked you to document your revision history and all that kind of stuff, right? Well, here's your revision history. Couldn't you just copy and paste your commit, like a screenshot of your commits? Yes, you could. If you use GitHub, that's just like indicating what your revision history is here in your documentation. And a lot of times people do that. They just take a snapshot of their commits. So what do I mean by that? What are commits? Going back to GitHub at a very high level, right now I only have one commit, right, for my space shooter game, right? The tutorial that I kind of made for you guys, right? Built off the tutorial that was online. Let's go there. If you notice, there's just one commit here, right? I'm going to add another one, just so you see what I'm talking about here. So I'm going to go back, and I'm going to add in a README file, right? I'm going to add a README file, and it's going to say space shooter. This repo is for students. Use this to start your assignment 1, right? Whatever. And then I want to, this is good, I want to include my README file. README file is really important because what it does is it gives me a little bit of context for each of my repos, right? So if it asks you, you can actually create your own commit. When you make a commit, you have to have a description, a short description of what the commit's about, this snapshot. Describe your snapshot, basically, right? That's what the commit is, right? And then if you want to, you can make an extended description here of what you want. Now, by default, when you create a README file, the default is create readme.md, right? So let's leave that default in there and press commit new file. When I do that, what happens is I now have a README that actually shows up here, and it's very useful to describe what the repo is about. Okay, that's what that is. Now, notice here that 27 of you have forked me on GitHub. That's good, right? What about this watch on watch stuff? What does that mean on GitHub? If you look at the interface here, if you look on watch, right, or watch, when you create or are part of a repository on your own repository, any changes you make to the repository are instantly emailed to you. So if you're working with somebody else and somebody makes a change, you're notified of that change. That's what happens. Now, it's sometimes really annoying if you're working with 5 people or you initialize the repository, but you don't really want to watch it. You don't really want to take care of it. You can actually click on watch here, and you won't get emailed every time, right? Every time a change goes through. Sometimes, you know what? You don't want to be emailed, period. So you just unwatch, and that's maybe not part of your workflow. Okay. Stars are also things like your favorites. So if it's one of your favorite repositories, and if you see somebody else's repository, you can give them stars. It kind of gives them the repository a boost when it comes to finding it in the results. If you want to do a search for different repositories, notice now that I have 2 commits. Right? I made the commit. The first commit was my initial commit, my space shooter tutorial commit, which was 32 minutes ago, right? And now I just made a new commit because I created my readme.md file, my markup file, or my markdown file, actually is what it is, right? And it's on the master branch, right? Because I only have one master branch. Now, guess what? Locally, in my command line now, I'm 1 commit behind. Why? Because online, I've added a readme file. But if I look locally, if I do a command, like a list command for my folder, I don't see a README file here. Why? Because on the repo on GitHub, it's been updated, but I haven't updated locally. The only way I can do that is do a pull. So if I do git pull, right, then what it does is it downloads my my README file. If you notice, it grabbed readme.md to include it here in my files. Now if I look, I have my readme.md file locally. So the state of Git and GitHub in general, just to finish off with that whole thing, it's a kind of a moving picture, right? You your initial repository, you make some changes, make some commits, and then as you continually commit, you have almost like a commit history here. Let me go back to the requirements. So that's what I've asked you to do in your internal documentation, kind of talk about the revision history. But how can you do that? How can you take a snapshot? Well, you want to say, well, it's, at please see commit 45, as an example of my files or whatever it is. That's your recent version. Or you can also version it like this. You can say version 0.01, right? I made some changes every time you make a change, and some people do this as well. Every file has their own version. Version 0.02, version 0.03 for every major version. For any minor glitch, if you want to fix something, a bug fix, you could also go 3 numbers deep, version 0.001. I just started the project. Version 0.010, right? My first major version. Version 0.011, my first major version with a bug fix, right? And so on. And when you get to version 1, officially, it's an official release, right? Some people do that kind of thing. Some people start with version 1, because it's their first release, and then version 1.1, 1.11, and so on until they finish. Each of the files can have this versioning, or you can have it for your entire project. It depends on you. All right, I'm going to skip by some of this stuff. Let's talk about some of this other stuff. I want to make a company logo. How could I do it? I could use Maya. I could use Blender. I could use some kind of Photoshop, right? A very flat file. It doesn't have to be 3D, some kind of 3D logo. It could be something very simple. Please don't steal a logo from somebody else and call it your own. I don't want you to take, Tupac's logo and say, hey, I love Tupac. Too bad what happened to him. I want to use that as my logo, right? That'd be bad, right? All right. Please don't take someone else's logo like Tupac's and someone else, right, and combine it to make your own. All right. That would be also bad, right? Let's talk about version history in the documentation. Here is you can actually use a screenshot to do your documentation, your version history here, right? How about an interface sketch? What do I mean by that? Where there's some really cool wireframing websites that are out there, and I'll share the link with you. One of them is, if I go to wireframing here, which is one of the ones I like to tell students about, is mockups.com. Go to mockups for me with a Q. And if you notice, there's a try it now, right? You can also sign up for free. Now, if you notice mockups here, I'm just going to kind of reduce the size of my screen so you guys can see it, right, a little bit more. It looks like this, right? And if you notice, there's some controls here that are drag and droppable onto your screen. I'm just going to erase all this stuff. And I'm going to kind of describe my game screen by making it like some kind of, screen like this, right? So this is my game screen. I'm going to kind of take a rectangle and drag it on, right? And assign how big my rectangle is going to be for my screen, because my shooter is going to be kind of in this shape. And now I'm going to kind of put on some other rectangles in there, because that's my avatar, right? As an example, here's my avatar. Is going to start down here, right? And maybe I'm going to have my, by the way, I'm using very primitive shapes. There's other shapes you can use here to kind of start drawing up and labeling what your game is going to look like. So what I want you to do is I want you to sketch out your game. Sketch out what you want before you start making changes. Maybe it's going to look like Space Shooter, the tutorial, in terms of your layout. Maybe not. Maybe it's going to be, you're going to make your own. But I want you to do at least one sketch of your game before you make it. Okay? It's really good practice, and it's great from a visualization perspective. So mockups.com, you can do that. And yes, you can sign up, and there's pricing involved, but nothing's stopping you from making a screenshot of what you're doing here, right? And including it in your document, right? That's kind of an easy fix. They're okay with that. Again, for limited use. If you're using it a lot, you really should sign up with them. They're a really great service. Okay. If you, from mockups, that's a really good one. Now, what about other ones? I'll give you one more of those kind of websites. There's another one that you can also use. I'll leave this page. Mockflow actually works very nicely as well. Mockflow. Okay, and I'll give you an example of what this looks like. I've made a sample site on mockflow.com, right? Where I want to do the same kind of idea, right? I have some components on the right-hand side this time, and I want to drag and drop some components on the left, which kind of describes my screen, right? That's equivalent to what I did before, right? So again, whether I have an image, I can kind of drag and drop a placeholder image. I have a rectangle that the image can be on top. If I can change the sent to front, for the thing, so I can change the order, the layout order of my objects, some kind of placeholder image there, and again describe my screen here with Mockflow. It's very similar. If you're looking for native tools, you can also do it with Photoshop or with something else like a Fireworks, GIMP, whatever. All I'm asking you to do is simple wireframes. Okay, very, very high level. Any questions around this? Okay, I need this as part of your external documentation requirement, right? And if you look, what is this worth? Don't go too crazy, because it's only worth 1 mark, 1 point actually, out of all your marks. This assignment's worth 41 points. The total assignment's worth 10%. what's this 1 point worth out of all those? I mean, they add up. If you add them, slowly up, this is an easy mark to get, right? Even if your assignment doesn't work, you still get this mark if you sketch it out, right? So please do that. Please don't hand in Space Shooter. You get 0 for that one, right? So I'll just give me back what I gave you. Don't go, oops, I didn't have time to do this, but guess what? I made Space Shooter again, right? No, right? Okay, how about assets? This is another thing of, we want to get some assets for our stuff. Where do we get them from? Well, there's some really cool places to get them from. One thing we did with COMP305, the people that were with me before, I gave them a bunch of assets, places that I used to use. 3D Warehouse is kind of an interesting place to go. 3D Warehouse, it's neat. Again, 3D Warehouse makes assets for SketchUp, right? So SketchUp. So you have to have SketchUp on your system. Remember we talked about Maya, we talked about Blender or 3ds Max. Well, SketchUp is another one that does assets, and it originally was Google SketchUp, and now it's just called SketchUp, right? And they have assets here in the 3D Warehouse for them. So you can actually look up for assets if you want to build something 3D-wise. That's one place to go, 3dwarehouse.sketchup.com. Okay, that's one. Let's talk about other ones. TF3DM, that's a good one to go to as well, right? And what this one gives you, again, is 3D assets, if you're going to use for 3D assets, and they're free, right? Some of them aren't. Some of them you have to pay for, but there's a large number of assets here that are free that you can actually download from tf3dm.com, right? So that's another place you can go. If you want to use, I was going to go to the other one that we used before. I think it's not 3D Warehouse. What was the other one? Texture, not Texture King. Texture King actually does too. There's a bunch of texture websites out there. One of them is Texture King. There's some free textures you can download if you wanted to use textures. One day we'll be talking about textures. That's one place to go. I'll give you other ones that are out there as well, right? And if I start typing 3D and something else, there's not just Warehouse, but there's other ones out there that are out there. If I do like free texture websites, right? You can actually look up. There's a bunch of them out there that'll come up, like CG Textures. That's what I was looking for. CGTextures.com. This is a really good one as well that I used in my Blender class last semester. So you can look for some free textures for when we're dialing up some of our own assets, right? And there's also opengameart.org. That's another place to go for game art that's been made by somebody else that's sharing it openly to you. That's a great place to go for not just 3D stuff, but 2D assets as well. And one of them, if I'm not wrong, is Kenny, right? I think it's Kenny. Is it Kenny? I can't remember what it was. Oh, no, it's not found. There's one that Kenny does. I'm not sure how he spells his name, but it's opengameart.org. Let me see if I can find it here. Open Game Arts Kenny. And yeah, it's just users Kenny. Sorry. He has a lot of different game art that both 2D and 3D that he offers up for free, right? That he's kind of created for both Unity and for 2D other 2D frameworks, if you will. And he's kind of one that's he's out in the Netherlands, right? And he has his own little website where he has some really cool stuff you can download and use for free. So that's another one that you can definitely go to. Here's some assets from Kenny, right? And if you notice, if you click on 2D or 3D, you can filter some of the assets that he gives you there for his stuff. So that's another one. Another one that I've been using since 2011, right? If you want to go to that one, is Reiner's tile sets. Reiner does stuff for 2D graphics, 3D graphics. He does textures. He does sound effects. He does all kinds of stuff that he shares openly with you guys that you can totally use for free, right? As long as you give him some props for doing the assets, he's cool with it, right? But the best one for Unity is the Unity Asset Store, right? So if I go to Unity, the Unity Asset Store, just look it up, right, like this, there are tons and tons of free assets. And there's also ones for a little bit of a cost. Like, for example, $55. Not a big cost for some of this stuff. But you can certainly look through here. And if I look through the asset store for Space Shooter, take a look here, right? There's my Space Shooter starter. And there's also, if I want to really be specific, there's a Space Shooter tutorial you can find online as well. So there's all kinds of Space Shooter assets on here. Please don't download and call the assets your own. Please, again, in your external documentation, you want to give props to people who've created these assets because it's not yours, it's theirs. So if I go again, if I go Space Shooter tutorial, right? So Unity tutorial, there's all kinds of stuff up here that I believe one of them is the same Space Shooter tutorial that's up there. And I think if you go to Unity Learn, right? One of the first things it'll tell you down here in the Space Shooter tutorial is where to get the assets. Download the assets free from the asset store right here. Here it is, right? And if you notice, once you say open in Unity or download, it'll download it and install it in your version of Unity. And you always have access to them forever, right? You can always include them as assets that are part of your library. We'll talk about that later on. Okay, so I can't say enough about this one. And someone asked me earlier, can I use Unity assets? Absolutely. That's what we do, especially when it comes to learning. And there's some really cool assets here that works for our games. If you want to put together a game, why reinvent the wheel if someone else has made it for you? If you want to spend a few bucks, you can get some stuff that someone else has created to make it work for you. All right, any other questions around that? So I've talked about the external document today, assignment number 1, Space Shooter. We've talked about GitHub a little bit. And then next day, when we get together tomorrow, we'll do more of an in-depth, how do I make some primitives? How do I script up some primitives in Unity, okay? Any questions at all before we depart for the day? All right, see you next day. That will be Wednesday for the most of you.